Okay, welcome back, everybody. And so I promised you a video summarizing the ancient Greeks and making sure that I somehow touched on the ancient Roman period. So that's what this video is going to be. And it is just basically an update from the other videos that I put up, mainly because those other videos are older. I've done them in the past. So this is sort of a fresh one. All right, so let's talk about summing up the ancient Greeks. When we talk about the ancient Greeks as a group, what we're talking about are those four that we started out with: Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, and the sophists. And of course, the sophists still exist. They did always exist even prior to the works of Plato and Isocrates. We know this because there were fights over wars. There were, the basically the sort of spoils of war and how they got divided up, particularly land wars. And also, they always needed somebody to handle a criminal defense or to advocate. But the oldest type of rhetoric, of course, is the ceremonial speeches of, eulogies and weddings and etc., celebrations, things that were happening in the present. And those are as old as, we can get, even looking at stories like Antigone, which is one of the, seminal Greek plays, which if you haven't read that yet, I apologize for the reference. But back to all the way back to the Iliad, the Odyssey, etc. And obviously with the Encomium on Helen, we know that there has been the practice of rhetoric by sophists for forever, and they continue. And one of the reasons why they do is because they make money. Not me, but all the other sophists make money. I don't really know that I can be qualified as a sophist. I always joke about this. I tell a friend of mine who we both got our PhDs. We both started at Oklahoma. I finished mine at Mizzou. She continued at Oklahoma. But through our academic careers, we both were granted tenure. Her a few years before me, but she decided she didn't want to stay in the academy. So she went off and started working for a boutique marketing company in Seattle, which sounds fantastic, right? Except she was calling me about a lot of the questions that she was dealing with there, which was frustrating. But she was also a quantitative social scientist at the time, whereas I was, definitely focused on the qualitative and on rhetorical methods of analysis. And finally, she started her own company where she trains people on how to persuade other people to buy into their business. So, literally, one day she called me and she was telling me that she was consulting with a person who is a motivational speaker. And she was explaining to them and training them and consulting them on how to sell themselves as a motivational speaker more. And I was like, wait, so you're giving public speaking advice to a professional public speaker and people pay you for this? And she said, well, yeah, check out my latest website. And so I did. And at the time, her website was like, how to find your sparkle. And I was just like, with that, I said, Michelle, you are classically trained like I am. You are supposed to teach them not just how to find their sparkle, but how to continue to function in society as a good citizen, giving a service or providing that service. And she said, yeah, I'm doing that. And I was like, no, you're not. I said, you're a freaking sophist. And she goes, and you're just a rhetorician. And that's sort of been a running joke with us. And I know it's sad. It's sad when nerds try to be funny, but we actually still have this joke running. Her name is Dr. Michelle Major, and she actually has published 3 books on this, her subject area, and the most recent one is called The 3-Word Rebellion, I think is the name of it. And she comes to the end of the book and says, of course, my 3-word rebellion is 3-word rebellion. What's yours? And I'm thinking to myself, I've got several. That I'm ready to say 3 words that I can say. And so she always asks me to write reviews of her books because she and I have these inside jokes. And so I'll write things like, this is a glorious example. This is on Amazon. This is a glorious example of sophistry like I have never seen. Michelle really takes the idea of a rhetorical position in sophistry to an extreme. And of course, as you're learning about this, you understand that what I'm saying is basically an insult. Like oh my God, you're practicing how to find your sparkle in a 3-word rebellion while I'm being paid jack to teach people about the ethics of the power of persuasion in rhetoric. And so she takes that very, very well, especially since I know she is a very ethical and upstanding person. I just find her work sometimes to be okay. Let's face it, I'm just jealous because she makes a lot more money than I do doing this. And that's exactly what the complaint was in ancient Greece, wasn't it? That the sophists, the people who taught rhetoric without ethics or without consideration for the customer or the student, they were considered to be unethical, horrible people who were not really practicing rhetoric, that they were just doing it for the money. And that's how I feel about her sometimes. But in fairness, I am just jealous that she lives in Seattle in an apartment in an old house with her husband and her 3 cats, and she just makes money by sitting there selling her book on Amazon. It's something I should try, maybe. I don't know. So that debate, that struggle between when people say something that has a negative effect, or when people say something that has a positive effect, or when people say something that has an effect and we're not sure how we feel about it. That question is not from the Capitol riots on January 6th of 2021. That is a question that has existed since literally since we've been studying human communication. Okay. So we know that, and we know that from the ancient Greeks. These sophists who have been with us since the beginning of time in various different forms. These days we say teachers and lawyers for the most part, who are pontificating for the purpose of making money. Um, that's not necessarily bad, by the way. I mean, first of all, if you know what teachers make, even college professors in the social science and the arts, you know that we're not doing this for the money. We're doing it for the lifestyle, very clearly. Also, when I die, I would like the word doctor to be on my gravestone. You know, we all have our motivations. For people whose motivation is just purely materialistic, it's just purely money, we say that they are willing to do anything to get that money, which sort of puts their morals and their ethics into question. And this was a great insult during the ancient Greek times. Apparently, these days, it's just not a thing. Of course, it is. We care about when people do things that we consider to be negative. If we didn't, we would not have an impeachment discussion going on about Donald Trump. Okay, so is the question of ethics and rhetoric still relevant? Yeah, turn on your TV. There you go. Even if you go onto YouTube, you'll find videos that will answer that question for you, I assure you. So when people ask me, why are you teaching those old dead guys and stuff from, 2 or 400 BCE, the answer is very simple, because the same questions we had back then, we're still exploring now. Do we have an answer or the answer? No. But do we have some? Yeah, we learn as we go. Has it taken us 2,400 years or so? Maybe even, I don't know how long. Has it taken us way too long to figure it out? Maybe, but that all depends on, your idea of how long is too long in the entire history of the human race. So, our very short-lived human existence here on the planet leads us to these higher end questions, these higher need value questions. No longer do we need to sit around wondering if the hunters are going to kill what we need to eat and the gatherers are going to make sure that we have a way to prepare that meat so that we can eat and be secure. No longer do we have that question. No longer do we ask questions of whether or not we can make a fire. We don't have these questions. We have questions that are on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a little higher on the scale. For example, how do we improve lives through the practice of rhetoric? What beautiful, eloquent, pretty things can we say to make our lives better in a certain situation? Those are the questions that we ask. And you may think, Dr. Dudash, that's nutty. And I will tell you, no, it's not. You do it every day. You may just not realize it yet. So, the first person we start off with, aside from this whole school of the sophists, is of course what you read from Gorgias, which of course is the Encomium on Helen, which tells us first of all to enjoy rhetoric, but also is the first time we see someone try to create a new history or a different world, a eulogy that creates immortality for a person through language. So that's the first time we see that. Then we have Plato come along, and Plato and Isocrates, like as I said, sort of coexisted. They were at sort of a same time, even though we usually put Isocrates later than Aristotle. That's not the timeline. The timeline was that Plato and Isocrates were contemporaries. Aristotle was a student of Plato's. Isocrates was a sophist. And so Plato started writing about why rhetoric was bad because the sophists abused its power. And of course, you read all that in Phaedrus, which is a fascinating story about, you know, Plato consistently repeating the same speech over and over again to prove that he could make it mean what he wanted it to mean. And that was one of his biggest complaints about rhetoric, of course. And that's what he tells Phaedrus, well, I can make it sound good too. I can use it to seduce you. I can use it to tell untruths and make you think that it's true. I can use it to make something sound both good and bad at the same time. I can use it to make something bad sound good and something good sound bad. So Plato outlines multiple complaints that he has about rhetoric. It can make the good sound evil and the evil sound good. It lies to you because it hides the truth or the reality of what something is. It's seductive. It can be used for evil. Okay. All of those things are reasons why Plato really hated rhetoric and the practice of it. Isocrates, as a sophist, of course, was practicing rhetoric and was literally the complete opposite. No, I mean, not only is rhetoric good, but it creates the reality that we live in for the most part. Words are the only thing that have meaning, and they're the only good thing that we have. And rhetoric is the thing that helps us communicate that. And he said that he should not be accused of things that he's not guilty of. So he writes himself a defense, and he explains why the sophists do things that are bad, but not why he would be considered bad. He separates himself from the sophists. And so in his two works, Against the Sophists and Antidosis, we get those stories of accusation and defense. And then we read Aristotle, and it seems almost like Aristotle may have talked to both Plato and Isocrates. Maybe he read or listened to lectures from Isocrates, and he and Plato had a discussion about it. I'm not really sure. But Aristotle seems to come down in the middle somewhere and say, wait a minute. Okay, first of all, you can't create anything out of words, but you don't have to always be lying when you're trying to describe the truth. In fact, if you're lying when you're trying to pretend to describe a truth, you're not practicing rhetoric. What you're practicing is coercion. or bad persuasion or evil intent, but it's not rhetoric, because rhetoric is done with ethics. Okay, it is an ethical practice, not an unethical one. And Aristotle is really the one who gives us all of the basic skeleton of what rhetoric is supposed to be, the three times it should be used, the way that we might use it, the topics it's used for, and some of its good and bad qualities. He also describes to us what the three things are that you absolutely have to have in order to be successful. He always has things in threes, twos or threes with Aristotle. There's two types of proofs, artificial and inartificial, and the artificial ones, there's three types of those: ethos, pathos, and logos. There's three genres or categories of speaking: epideictic, deliberative, and forensic. I got it. There's all these groupings that he has as requirements for speaking in public, because he feels that rhetoric should only be used in very specific instances, because if it is dangerous, it's not a good time to use it. And we have those in our same laws. If you look at our laws, heck, just look at what's going on right now. I have never been so relevant in current events before, right? Because teaching rhetoric is very rarely demonstrably relevant. It's always under the wire, under the level of seeing that it's below the surface. But now it's just out in the open, because all of a sudden people are saying things like, "You're giving us misinformation. There's a disinformation campaign going on." It's crazy, right? Or your rhetoric is inciting violence, and that's bad. We don't want that. Now, am I the one coming up saying, well, it's only rhetoric if it's doing good, not bad? No, I'm not going to say that, because nobody buys that. Thank you to Peter Ramus, who we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. How do you answer that? And the answer is that you should not practice rhetoric that leads to harm, right? Ultimately, that was what Aristotle was trying to say too. And we even have it in our laws. Hate speech. Hate speech is speech that is considered an act of hate. So it's no longer just rhetoric. It's a rhetorical act. It actually does something. And most of us in the contemporary who study rhetoric actually look at rhetoric as an act. When you say something, you're doing something, whether that's defining something, defining the negative, creating a feeling, an emotion, producing some sort of action, inducing some sort of action through persuasion, whatever. That's how we feel about it. It's an act. So when you speak, you do something. Now, I don't know that Aristotle believed that. What I do know is that Aristotle believed that you could use rhetoric to spread knowledge and truth. And that's what he was really about, was that there is a truth out there, just like Plato thinks, but that we can share that truth through the art of rhetoric. And Socrates and Aristotle agree on that point. So Aristotle sort of takes those two ideas of being able to use rhetoric to express truth and use rhetoric to find truth. And he takes those two ideas and he puts them together, because remember, Plato hated rhetoric. Plato felt that rhetoric could also be used to create truths that aren't there, to create reality that isn't there. And of course, the only person who could know what the truth was the philosopher king, which was Plato. I think the problem was that Aristotle knew that, even through some level of immortality that you are given through your language or your teachings, as Socrates said, through teaching the students in his school, or however you felt that you achieved it, that there would be mortality, you would die. And so Plato's idea that only he knew the truth was really problematic, because we wouldn't be able to ever know anything since Plato's been dead for over 2,000 years, right? So Aristotle was a little bit more realistic about what the role of rhetoric could be. And even though Gorgias says we create the type of immortality someone's going to have as we write their story, their narrative, if you will, Aristotle said, yeah, it can do that, but it can't exist on its own. So rhetoric has to perpetuate itself, which of course is what Isocrates also extended, that it must perpetuate itself by teaching students. And so by the time we come out of the Greek period, which, depending on who you read, Greece was, sort of gone by about 150 BCE to 100 BCE. The practice of rhetoric was left to the sophists, the traveling sophists, really more than anybody else. And that, of course, meant that for about 200 years or so, we didn't know what the heck was going on. Or 150 to 200 years, we didn't know what the heck was going on with rhetoric. Andrew the Great was gone, Aristotle was gone, Plato was gone, and nobody was paying attention to Greece anymore because it had fallen. And of course, it was not a republic. It was attempting to be a direct democracy. It just wasn't successful. And so it was successful for some time, but it had to fail eventually, which it did. So then we jump to Rome. And I mean, I don't know about you, but sometimes I sit here going, what the hell happened between Greece and Rome? I mean, it's not like Greece popped up and then went off the planet and Rome popped up. That's not how this works. We move from Greece to Rome because that is the next place that we see rhetoric being practiced. Now, this is where we get into the question of why Eastern philosophy and Eastern political theory does not have, any references to rhetoric in it. It has some, okay, but not a lot. And here's why. Most of the Eastern cultures had a different power structure than the Western cultures, like Rome and Greece. The Eastern cultures had a much more centralized power system. That's not bad, by the way. They had kings or pharaohs or dynasties of rulers where you knew who had the power and who didn't. And the majority definitely was not asked what they believed. Okay, so the idea of democracy, of where more people have power than just one, that idea is uniquely Western. And so when people say, oh, well, you ignore Eastern contributions to this, we don't. It's just that they didn't have the need for rhetoric that the Western cultures did because, and this is a formula that I think is important, the more centralized a power, the less need for rhetoric. Okay, the more centralized a power, the less the need for rhetoric. Because if you have 1 or 3 or 5 people determining what the truth is and telling you what the laws are and making the rules, then you don't need to have a big discussion about it with the citizens of that place. And that's okay. That's not bad. It's just a different form of leadership. The idea that authoritarian leadership is bad leadership is not true. There are plenty of times where it's been needed, but in the cases of the Eastern cultures at the time, they weren't even horrible authoritarian governments. There were some very benevolent authoritarian governments. So, this is not a commentary on good versus bad. This is a commentary on when rhetoric is necessary and when it's not. If Aristotle is correct that rhetoric is the practice also of being able to explain the government to its citizens, that's part of its job, then why would you need to explain anything to your citizens in a leadership where few people have power? So it was in the Western governmental systems, the political theory, where you needed the citizens to know what was going on and therefore needed them to have information, to have the government explain to them, to find out what the citizens wanted and take it to the assemblies that were making the laws. In other words, a republic, a democracy, direct democracy, or a republican democracy, even a monarchical democracy, where you have a monarchy, but you also have a parliament and you have rule or power that is dispersed amongst the people. The one place I think of more than any is Canada. They are very good at that particular type of democracy. We did not want that type of democracy in our history, so we rejected the monarchy for our own democracy. And so when people talk about the American Revolution, what they're really talking about is the American rejection of the king, the right to rule themselves or ourselves, but we wanted to disperse that power through the people. Canada found a way to do that, and pretend that they still talk to the monarchy. It's kind of an interesting relationship that they have there, but they managed to work it out, whereas we did not. Of course, now we're all very confused because I often comment, we're the original Brexit. Which, by the way, is true. We left Great Britain and did our own thing. And there were some rough hundreds of years there, because we didn't have their support, whereas Canada didn't have to worry about that, as they established themselves. So, interesting point there. But it more demonstrates the second part of this power situation I'm talking about, which is, the more decentralized the power, the more the power is spread out amongst people in democracies, democratic republics, and so on, then the greater the need for rhetoric. So the more centralized a power, the less need for rhetoric. The more decentralized a power, the greater need for rhetoric. Now, some of you might be thinking, but Hitler was a great rhetorician and he was an authoritarian, and so how does that jive? Because he really needed rhetoric. Well, first of all, he needed rhetoric to move up to become the head of the Nazi Party and therefore to lead Germany, right? He needed it then to convince all these people to follow him. He didn't need it after that. All of his great speeches that you see are simply demonstrations at that point of power, because he used coercion to get people to do what he wanted. I mean, do this or you're hitting the firing squad is not persuasion, and it's not rhetoric. That is coercion, and violent coercion at that. So Hitler did not need rhetoric. If he gave a great speech, it was just because he had that ability to do so, not because it was going to empower anyone or help him gain more power. He already had it. Okay. So if you have someone like an emperor or a king or Hitler telling you what's going to be and what's not going to be, then the people are not empowered, or more than one person is not empowered at that point. Therefore, no one needs to know how the government works. They just need to know that the one person who's in power has made this dictate. Okay. So again, the more dispersed the power, the more decentralized the power, the greater the need for rhetoric. Your people need to know what the hell's going on. But the more centralized the power, where you have just one or very few people, an oligarchy, for example, making those decisions for the people, you don't need rhetoric anymore. The less rhetoric, the less the need for rhetoric. Okay. That is defined by the Roman period. Okay, so what's in the Roman period? Well, first of all, I have a much more detailed video I've recorded in the past that I'm going to put up for you. But generally speaking, what's important out of the Roman period is that there are two main theorists who come from two main types of government in Rome. For those of you who don't know, Rome is in Italy, and they spoke Latin before they spoke Italian. I had to tell you that because I've had people not understand that before, and that's okay because it can get confusing. Why don't we call it Italian? The Italian system? Well, mainly because it wasn't this whole Italian thing. It was just Rome, and there was no Vatican yet. I mean, so it was literally Rome. All right. So in Rome, and I believe that the whole country was called Rome at the time. I'm not really sure. I'd have to double check that. Don't quote me on that part. I'm not a history teacher or a geography teacher, obviously. So during the Roman period, these two periods that we have actually, the government was two different types of government. At first, between about 100 BCE, and we know in there between about 150 or so BCE, it was the Roman Republic. And the republic, like ours, was representative. You had senators who were elected, and of course, these were men who owned land and generally were rich. But Isocrates trained some people to learn how to move up through the system, and therefore so did Cicero. And that's our first big guy. Cicero really did a lot. And there's actually a really good movie I've seen a couple times, but I couldn't tell you the name of it. It's basically a biopic of Cicero, who is this great speaker and who can gain power through his speech. And therefore, he was considered a great leader in the government, a great representative of the citizens. And the Roman Republic was democratic. Some people believe that the day Cicero died, was the day that the art of rhetoric was no longer in existence. Okay. I'll tell you why. First of all, Cicero wrote what we now call probably the first public speaking textbook. Okay. It was basically, if you've read it, which you should have or you will be this week, um, it's literally step by step how to do rhetoric, basically. So he took all of Aristotle's ideas, summed them up into 5 canons: Inventione, the wow, really? I've forgotten the word uh, dispositio. There we go. Inventione, dispositio, and then you have, depending on who you talk to, elocution, and then you have memoria, and then you have actio. And those mean, of course, invention, arrangement, style, memory, delivery. Now, your book may flip those a little bit, I'm not sure. But here's what we do know: invention, arrangement come first. Those two: invention, then arrangement. Most people put memory or put style next. Some people put memory, but most put style, then memory, then delivery. Others put memory, style, delivery. Either way, delivery is always at number 5, and invention and arrangement are always at number 1 and 2. Why? In invention, you determine who you're talking to, how you're going to talk to them, what you want them to say, what your goals are, and how you're going to achieve it. That's kind of necessary to start. Arrangement, or dispositio, meaning disposition, the place where you put your argument, is important. This is not organizational patterns from 115, people. This is literally making your argument in such a way that your audience can follow you to the conclusion. So arrangement is not organization alone. Arrangement is a specific organization intended to make your speech more effective. Okay. And then style, Cicero really had a very specific idea about style. I'll let you read it. I don't know if they've put it in there or left in there in this edition about what color toga you should wear, and how you should speak to certain groups, but he actually gives us the three levels of style: the grand, the middle, and the common style. And all of them are formal speaking. None of them mean I'm having a conversation with you, or I'm giving you a lecture, or we're having a Socratic method education system. Literally, these are formal speeches, even in the common style. The common style just merely means that I'm looking at your level of education, and I'm taking it to that level so that you can understand what I'm talking about. Anytime you've heard somebody say, talk to me like I'm a 6-year-old, or talk to me like I'm in 5th grade, what they're saying is you need to bring me to the argument, or to the claim, or to the explanation by making sure I understand what it is that you're saying through the words that you use, the references that you make, and the level of knowledge you believe I have. Okay. So when we say that, we mean like, assume I know nothing. Assume I know very little about the subject matter that you're talking about. And that's not dumbing down, just so we're all clear on that. That is not what common style is. It is an understanding that some people know more about some things than others. I mean, for the love of God, if you want to tell me how to artificially inseminate a cow, you're going to go through a lot of steps with me than you would with my friend Austin, okay? Because Austin knows how to artificially inseminate a cow. I do not. I don't even know if I could picture that. So the point is that we have different levels of knowledge. You need to know what your audience's level of knowledge is. The middle is literally formal, but not as grandiose as the grand style. A lot of times when I think about the grand style, I think of Joel Osteen. You know, like, we are all going to hell, but that is okay. Can I get an amen? I love that guy. I don't know why. I mean, I don't think I like him as a person, but I can't not listen to him. He is so inviting and engaging when he speaks. He could be giving me a recipe. I don't even care, but it's an engaging style. It's an enthusiastic style. And by the way, it's called grand partially because you use big gestures. Grand gestures. Open up your arms and speak in this grand and enthusiastic, well, very eloquent way. Um, so grand actually is for specific events. People talk about the presidents of the United States. Do I see any of them having a grand style? I mean, I guess Kennedy, maybe. Obama, maybe. Reagan, maybe. I'm not positive on those because they're limited by television and space and time, more than anything, but also because they're speaking to the general public. So even, Barack Obama, President Obama, when he spoke, it wasn't in the grand style, meaning that he was speaking in a way that we couldn't understand. If he used a word that you didn't understand, I would have to know what that word was. But to speak well is not the grand style. Okay. But I think more, Reagan, Kennedy, Obama to me are more honestly the middle style. It's formal. It's not using common language, but or totally common, because there has to be some separation between the president and the citizens. He, not because he stands above us in a literal or in a metaphoric way, but yeah, the president is the head servant, and he is different from all of us, or she, future, is different from all of us. They are not the same as us, because they're they're in the public, literally, as representatives of all of us. So whether they're public servants or leaders or however you define them, they're still separate from us, and therefore their language should separate themselves from us in some way, at some level. Who uses the common style when they speak formally? George Bush, Bill Clinton, those are more common than anything. So you might ask the question, well, if I put George Bush and Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, by the way, in the common style, what if I put Obama and Kennedy and Reagan in the grand style? Who qualifies for the middle at that point? And you'd be looking at Carter. You'd be looking at H.W. Bush, who, by the way, is my favorite of all of those when it comes to speaking. He had um, a common denominator with all of us, and at the same time, as former head of the CIA, he knew a lot more than we did. Okay, so he was able to reach to us and also look credible, which I find important. People still ask how he lost to Bill Clinton, and I have to admit, I've heard every analysis that there is, and I still have times where I go, interesting. Not sure how that happened. But that's not due to politics, by the way. There, I'm just talking about presentational style. Let's face it, if you have Hillbilly Bill out there talking about his boxers instead of his briefs, and talking about whether or not he inhaled marijuana, and talking about, because of course he did, I'm sure, and talking about playing his saxophone on one of the late night talk shows, that's not who you see as your president. That's not what I would commonly call presidential. But George H.W. Bush definitely had that very formal presence of knowing the government and what his place was and what his role was. And that election changed everything about how we thought about presidential rhetoric. So, and there were many reasons for that, not just who was there, but many other reasons. So, whenever I think about the grand, middle, and common style, I usually put it in terms of presidents for myself. I don't know why. I wish there was a different way to do it, or televangelists apparently. And then, of course, memoria, memory, and this did in ancient Greece mean memorizing, right? Of course, because we've talked about this, that people actually went out and had to repeat speeches like we saw in Phaedrus, and therefore you had to be able to remember what the main points were and being able to rehearse that back for the people, because you're literally representing that speech. You're representing some ideas and you have to represent them properly, right? So, that memoria is really about the tradition of speaking, the tradition of building credibility. That's the type of memory, memoria, tradition that we're talking about, not just memorizing. And then finally, why is delivery last? I'm asked this all the time, because if you have crappy delivery, we're not going to hear the rest of it. Yes, but if you have awesome delivery and nothing to say, that's also pretty irrelevant. So I can listen to you all I want and not get anything out of it. That is not good rhetoric. So all 5 of the canons are key. And of course, Aristotle says that you cannot achieve invention properly without inartificial and all 3 artificial or artistic proofs. Okay, so we know that from Aristotle, and it's carried through to Cicero. How did they kill Cicero? There's all sorts of stories about this, but one thing we do know is that they did cut off his hands, and they did cut off his tongue, and they did cut off his head and put it on a spike on the outer wall of the town. His tongue and his hands were nailed to, I believe, the front hall of the Senate. Why? Well, Cicero's greatest power was considered to be in his tongue and in his hands. They wanted to kill that. They didn't want him to have that kind of power. By the way, there's a real soap opera version of this that involves Cleopatra that's very fascinating, but probably untrue. So instead, we stick with the actual history that we know, which is that the Roman Republic started to um, become more centralized. There was a triumvirate created. That triumvirate uh, actually they couldn't figure out what to do with Cicero because they wanted Cicero to be in the triumvirate, and he said, "No, are you kidding me? I'm not going to let you destroy Rome this way." And so they killed him. So, as I said, some people believe that that is the day that rhetoric died because um, it was the literal shutting up of a great speaker. After that, Rome went through a little bit of a change and moved from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. You know, I realize I was born during the Star Wars age. I'm a total Gen Xer. But the word empire does not inspire a lot of happy thoughts for me. Maybe it's because I relate it to like Darth Vader and stormtroopers. I don't know. But an empire is a centralized government system. Okay. So by this time, we start to see the emperors develop. We start to, get into the time of Caesar, and along comes Quintilian. And Quintilian loved Cicero, and Quintilian loved the practice of rhetoric. And so Quintilian wanted to find a way for him to write. For him to teach rhetoric without getting his hands and tongue cut out. So, what did he do? Well, he admired Cicero so much, and he talked about how great Cicero was, but he did it carefully because, of course, again, they killed Cicero. So he wrote what we call the handbook, or the teacher's edition, the teacher's handbook to Cicero's public speaking book. Quintilian explained how to teach to the royalty, to the emperor's children, to those high in power, how to teach them rhetoric. And yes, that gave him the chance to talk about ethics and to talk about leadership and to talk about, um, you know, um, rhetoric as a representation of truth because it would empower those who were already in power. So he sort of wrote what we call the teacher's edition. And what's the difference between Cicero and Quintilian? Well, let's see. Quintilian wrote and protected himself. Cicero wrote to empower others. But that doesn't make it necessarily bad. Quintilian understood who his audience was. But you'll notice that Quintilian's definition of a great orator is a good person speaking well, meaning that he brings in that idea of ethics first. In order to practice rhetoric, you have to be a good person. Now, of course, most of the emperors didn't realize what he was saying was, you should not be practicing rhetoric because you got power through coercion. So you are not good at this. But, that's sort of what he was doing, which is interesting because a couple hundred years later, several hundred years later, Shakespeare will come along and use that same sort of trick or trope when he writes plays within his plays that are making fun of the king and queen. Which of course is a brilliant way to do this, and Quintilian taught us how to do that, which is awesome. And that brings us to the end of the Roman period. In there, I had you read, I think, a little bit of Longinus and also the Rhetorica ad Herennium, if I remember correctly. And the Rhetorica ad Herennium is an explanation of what we call the stasis system, which is the way that we ask questions in the courtroom to get to the answer we want to get to. And of course, Longinus is talking to us about the sublime nature of language, how it can make us feel like we're in a place other than where we are. I'm not talking about ASMR here, by the way. I'm talking about creating in you a feeling of being somewhere other than in that audience at that moment. We talk about plays, we talk about movies, we talk about art that lifts us into a different world and makes us feel differently than where we are right this second. And um, Longinus really is talking about the fact that rhetoric can do that as well. Some of you um, might understand this if you ever listen to a professor who is maybe not attractive to you in any way, but the way that they exert the power of language suddenly makes them attractive. I don't mean in a sexual way, but attractive to listen to, attractive to watch. And then you are transported into a place that isn't sitting in a chair in a classroom, for example. If any of you are Supernatural fans, at one point, Sam says to Dean, "What are you going to do about this?" And he said, "I'm going to fight, Sam." And Sam says, "Well, that's sublimation, you know." And Dean said, "Yeah, sort of my thing." Um, I believe I almost directly quoted that, sadly. And what are they talking about here? Well, whenever you're in a situation that makes you unhappy or sad, you want to avoid that emotion. What do? You sublimate, um, a different activities. So for some people, it's I'm going to paint, I'm going to craft, I'm going to do karate, I'm going to do tai chi, I'm going to do yoga, whatever it is. I'm going to listen to music. That thing that's sublime means that it's the thing that can help us to climb out of, exceed, get over, become feeling better about the bad thing by having this other thing in our lives. We do it all the time. I mean, mine is chocolate. I am not gonna lie to you. I'm a diabetic. I need my chocolate. That's hard to work into a diet, just so we're all clear. But a diabetic's diet, I mean. But I do it. You find a way to put it into your eating plan. It's not a diet; it's an eating plan because I really need chocolate sometimes, and that's okay. You certainly don't want to kill yourself with whatever it is that you use to sublimate the rest of life. Longinus doesn't give us tips on how to do that, but he certainly does give us tips on how to utilize rhetoric and art for the purpose of sublimation. So that's a fascinating read. It's not one I've done recently, but I remember enough of it there for that. You don't need to focus on the stasis system or on Longinus too much. I mean, I want you to know the basic ideas, but really those four ancient Greek schools of thought and the two main governmental systems and rhetoricians from the Roman period. That's what we're working on right now. And once we get through the exam, well, actually, next week, I believe we start reading into the Middle Ages. So, you may want to take the exam before you start reading the Middle Ages, but you don't have to. Don't confuse yourself. That's what I'll say. So, this first exam is going to cover the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. It will include the Rhetorica ad Herennium. It will include Longinus. Okay. So there you go. I hope that helps. Questions and comments and so on should go on to the Dear Professor or Dear Fellow Students on your bulletin board, on Blackboard, the discussion board, or you can email me, but your best bet, if you need to contact me sooner rather than later, is to send me a text. You all have my number. It's on the syllabus on Blackboard. So we'll be in touch soon. I will talk to you all later. And also, I will be doing a short video on your papers, probably this week before Friday, because people have asked me for that. And so I do need to get on that, but I wanted to cover the test and the Romans today. All right. Y'all have a good one. Stay safe. Talk to you soon.